Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for for joining our webinar today. This is webinar number 2. It's our series that we're doing to talk about project and program and portfolio management excellence. We've got a 6-part series here. And basically what we're going to do is talk about some of the opportunities for developing an outstanding PPM capability, what some of the best practices and leading practices that are going on. And we'd like to present this as a series. So the idea being that that one topic is going to roll into the next and roll into the next. I don't know if any of you have attended episode 1, but that was focused on agile processing. I'm sorry, digital transformation and PMO. This episode is focused on project management with Agile and Waterfall approaches, and both of those, are methodologies that we have for delivering these particular projects. And we're going to focus today largely a lot of it on Agile because you're seeing things like Agile transformation and Agile organizations, and also Waterfall-based approaches and when we should use each one of these. So thank you for joining today, and please join episode 3. This is a pretty good webinar. This is a pretty good webinar. We have a good amount of material today to cover. Again, who we are. We are Quantum PM. We are a Gold Microsoft partner in specializing in project and program and portfolio management, Power BI and reporting, integration with Azure, and solutioning using the Azure stack. And basically what we do here is develop best-in-class PPM solutions for our customers, usually integrated in many cases with other technology platforms to provide the enterprise capability that supports an organization. So let's talk about today we're talking about Agile and Waterfall. I'm not sure how familiar with most of you are, but usually Waterfall-based approach you can categorize as more of a sequential with a big outcome at the end is the way to describe it. The graphic at the top where we talk about requirements design, development, testing, deployment, typically that's the way projects have been delivered via the technology. And when I use the word projects here, for purposes of our discussion today, it's going to be technology projects, but also things like new product development projects, engineering, construction projects. It can be all kinds of things. But really, these are more of a linear and sequential-based project-based outcome. What we've been seeing since 2000, largely in technology, but now it's about the agile organization and developing solutions that are iterative in nature. That's something the trend has been accelerating for quite a while. And I think the driver there, in a lot of cases, is digital transformation. I mean, we talked last time about the impact of digital transformation and the confluence of technology and process, and how all that fits together. And I think the idea that Agile is a mechanism for rapidly addressing change that's going on in the ecosystem, it's a very effective method for doing it. But whole Agile adoption. I mean, there's a statistic here. In McKinsey, for example, the whole idea of how many companies have adopted Agile, and it's about 22%. So it's really quite poor. I mean, and I know my experience as a consultant, the vast majority of companies that adopt Agile, they're doing it piecemeal, or largely they're focused on Waterfall. And I think a lot of that's because of the inability to communicate the value proposition of Agile, and the adoption aspect of it as well, because a lot of executives are like, well, what do I get at the end? And that's usually the challenge, that communicating that can be an issue. But in terms of innovation, rapid response with digital transformation, I mean, Agile is definitely the way that many organizations are addressing this. So here's some of the trends that we have, and I don't know if you ever read McKinsey Quarterly, there's a quotation here at the bottom, but there was an article about how to create an agile organization where a lot of this was, I borrowed a lot of the McKinsey global survey information came from there. Really, it's more important than ever for organizations to be able to respond and adapt quickly, because we talked about, digital transformation around competition and internal demand and technology. The ability to reconfigure strategy and structure and process and people, toward value creation and value protecting opportunities is hard for many companies to do, per the McKinsey survey. Many companies have not fully implemented Agile. We talked about 22% adoption. Companies that are more volatile and in uncertain environments are more likely than others to pursuing Agile transformation. And I think that's an interesting point, because if you think about companies that are in volatile and uncertain environments like retail, telecommunications. I mean, those are the ones that have to be able to respond more quickly to the change that's impacting their operating environment. And then innovation, customer experience to operations and strategy. It's really about how we're doing that in terms of bringing things to market on a quicker basis. I mean, and here's an example here. I mean, we talked about organizational agility is catching fire. Some of the drivers we talked about, emerging technologies and digital transformations. The other one is the whole concept of availability of data. Like IoT, the impact of IoT, the availability of analytics and sources of data. They talked about like here, what are some of the key, who's actually adopting these agile type environments. And they talked about, if their business environments are unstable, are more likely to say that organizations have already begun transforming. And if you look at it, here's the higher degree of instability on the bottom, on the x-axis. On the y-axis, this gives you the indication of what industries have adopted it. If you think about it, look at this, high technology, telecommunications, financial services, retail, media, healthcare. I know from my own experience. I mean, a lot of the companies that I deal with as a consultant. I mean, a lot of the pharma companies, telecom. I mean, these are all ones that are high on the adoption framework for for overall agile adoption and pursuit. This is an interesting. This is a interesting slide. I mean, one of the other questions you have to ask yourself is, what are some of the characteristics of agile organizations? And really, the way to describe it is it's both dynamic and stable, which you would think is not necessarily contradictory, but a dynamic in processes enables companies to respond nimbly and quickly to new challenges and opportunity. While stable practices cultivate reliability and efficiency by establishing a backbone of elements that don't change as frequently. I mean, what that's telling you there is that you've got ability to be dynamic, you've got processes to be dynamic, but you need to have a stable and solid foundation to be able to do that. And I think some good examples of that, if you think about it, the big adopters here. I mean, Apple and Amazon, they've got that stability, but they've also got that ability to adopt quickly. And I think I think the other thing we talked about last time about digital transformation, the spoils go to the big adopters, and I think that's what you're seeing here. There's a centralization, or the winners here are the ones who tend to be out in this more agile type organization. That you're finding that the people who are laggards, for example, are not able to respond as quickly to organizational change opportunities, and they're suffering as a result of that. And the other thing that we talk about agile organizations and we talk about paradigm shifts. Some of the other drivers here is we've got old paradigms, organizations as machines, and I think this McKinsey study talked about this quite well, where you've got for the old waterfall based approaches, top down and hierarchy. I mean, the way to think of agile versus waterfall. Waterfall is more of a top down hierarchy driven thing where you've got you know strategies and business processes that are flowing from the top. You've got detailed silos which provide the supply in many cases of a capability that are being used to go ahead and constantly go ahead and basically react to what's being done from a top-down side. And this is more of a reactive type model. The top tells you to do it, and then the bottom does it. But the new paradigm is a way to describe it, and this is a McKinsey term, is the living organism term, where essentially you've got this leadership in the middle here, which sets direction and enables action. But then you've got these individual teams that sit around it, which are flexible, have quick changes. They've got ability to basically germinate and come up with ideas as they develop. And one of the things we're going to talk about later on is we're going to talk about some case studies about where this has been adopted, and they all talk about the importance of the organizational aspect of it that fits into this. And some of the other best practices also talk about the ability to go ahead and implement things like that support metrics and things that can allow you to measure success and communicate that to the top. The other thing, this whole thing about leadership direction, I think the other aspect here is organizational leadership support, because communicating value is one of the key challenges that organizations have, and the ability to do that is pretty important. Any questions so far, Lori? Does anybody texted anything?
Hi, No questions at this point.
Okay, yeah. If people have any questions, feel free to put them in your text box, and we will stop and pause periodically to go through those. Um, yeah, here's a way to think about it. Some of the characteristics of an agile organization. And this was also a McKinsey quarterly from January. At least a lot of the slide was, at least the graphic here on the right was. Um, Essentially, basically, re-image the North Star embodied across the organization, or agile organizations re-image both who they are creating value for and how they do it. They're focused on the customer, okay, and they seek to meet the diverse needs across the entire customer life cycle. Yes, I mean that's a pretty important one. It's all focused on the customer. How do we address the need and the whole life cycle aspect of it, and consistency across the life cycle is pretty critically important. Um, the other aspect of this is the committing to creating value with a wide range of stakeholders, employees, investors, partners, and communities. We really need to understand that when we talked about the living organism again, is value is not just, it's not just we're focused exclusively on the customer. We talked about the importance of organizational buy-in. So investors, partners, and communities. I think that's all very important here. And the other thing is the whole other aspect of this. One of the other five is a network of empowered teams. You must have a stable top-level structure, but most of the traditional hierarchy must have a scalable network of teams. Really, you got the top-down side of here that sets the priorities and the direction of the organization, and most importantly, is supportive of the agile transformation. But in terms of the flexibility and scalable of network teams, those are things that that needs to be fluid and more responsive to where the value is perceived to be deliverable, both to the customers, but also to the different stakeholders that exist within the overall organization. Let's talk about some of the other ones here. Rapid decision and learning cycles. This is an interesting. The whole thing is you've got sprints, lots of cycles, 2 weeks. It needs to be aligned with creativity, and you really to be able to execute and function very effectively with those defined learning cycles that are associated with it, and be able to make decisions quickly. And again, that's back to the organizational alignment. One of the things about an agile organization is it must be something that is aligned with the organizational objectives. We need to make sure that from an organizational perspective, we've got the support that'll allow for rapid decision making. And then the other question here, integration and continual rapid iteration, thinking, doing, and learning forms innovate the way that we operate in an agile way. But really the key theme here is rapid cycles. Make sure we do it, and we've got an organization in place that's supportive of that and allows for quick decision making. Then the other part is the people. Dynamic people couldn't function in this type of environment. I think millennials in a lot of cases, this is kind of what they're thinking. We need people who are more creative and less structured, but more able to let's focus on the value for right now. Create the value quickly and then effectively. And then the last part is, next generation enabling technologies, and I think that's a big part here. We talked about, agile capabilities, rapid decision making. I think the whole aspect of, technology, what's going on with cloud, for example, IoT, the whole digital transformation and analytics and understanding. One of the things we talk about is the 360-degree touch on the customer. There's so much data and there's so much technology that provides so much information. The concept of value is constantly emerging, but at the end of the day, it's focusing on the customer, figuring out what their needs are from all their different places, from all the different touches that they have, and then being able to deliver on that. I had a client once who focused on it was an aerospace company, and that was one of the big challenges that they had was who are their customers. We talked about it for a while, and it turned out that the customers were anybody who touches the aircraft. And I think that was something from the technology that they had was providing that information, but they didn't understand it from a business perspective. So I think the whole idea of enabling technologies, driving agile transformation, that's also a big driver, because you kind of have to, between what's going on with digital transformation, the rapid change that's going on from a data perspective and the confluence of data and the flood of data. I mean, last session we talked about there's been more data created in the last 2 years than there was in all the time before that. I mean, it's just tremendous the amount of impact and change that's going on. So technology is a major driver for that. Okay. Any questions at this point, or are we good? Anything so far, Lori?
No questions at this point, John.
Okay. Let's talk about adoption. I mean, we talked at the beginning of this about 22% of organizations are have adopted Agile. So adoption has been a big challenge. I mean, I know personally as a consultant, I see that all the time. The ability to transfer down from a waterfall, as we call it, a top-down planning to an Agile, grassroots enabling, is quite daunting. Key reasons why the move to Agile fails. And this is true. I mean, the whole idea of you see this thing, an Agile project manager versus an Agile leader, an Agile coach. I mean, the whole concept of Agile and Scrum is that you need to have collaboration within an Agile team, and the ability to, in effect, to coach this team versus being a traditional PM that is part of the operational and that has to do with how we actually go ahead and execute the team. And a lot of times when you do project management, it's like they do the traditional project management, and then as a result of that, the people just fall back into the old waterfall-based approaches and waterfall ways. The other aspect of it is the whole "we are different" concept. And that's something you see all the time. And as somebody, again, as a consultant, you see this all the time. The clients are like, "Oh, we're different than these other guys. We can't do it." Especially in the area of like cloud adoption, for example, they all like, "Well, we can't do cloud." It's like, well, actually, you can, because a lot of other companies are doing it, and you really find out that from an organizational perspective, you really aren't all that different. I mean, they're still facing a lot of the same challenges within the industry and business in general. The same technology drivers are out there, and the idea of digital disruption, the whole idea of the flood of information, mergers and acquisition activities, business process optimization. I mean, these are things that, in many cases, I see that the solutions, cross industries and apply across the board. I mean, one of the things I talk about all the time is the whole customer-centric journey, for example. That's ripe for digital transformation. It's get out there, let's iterate. I've implemented those. I've talked about those types of solutions within healthcare, financial services, manufacturing, high technology. I mean, government. Pretty much every industry I've worked in, those themes are true. So to be honest with you, you're really, frankly, companies are not all that different. Number 4 is an interesting one. It's value delivery and Agile fall. I mean, the challenge many organizations have, and that's what I was saying earlier about the whole importance of organizational buy-in and acceptance, is because a lot of times when a board of directors or a company goes ahead and says, well, let's do a particular project, they need to have like a logical output of that project. In many cases, it's hard to convey the value proposition when you're doing an Agile-based approach. And in many cases, I've found that, sometimes, and we're going to talk about this later, but it really is important that you have an organization that is accepting of the idea that, iterative delivery, because of the fact that you are in effect prototyping continuously, you're going to get a more dynamic and evolved solution than you would get if you do a waterfall-based approach. So that's one. And we talk about the term Agile fall, and I'll tell you when that happens. And that's a challenge every company I've dealt with who tries to adopt. The idea, it's like, well, what can we deliver in a 2-week sprint? It turns out, well, let's do the 3-week sprint, then the 4-week sprint, then the 5-week sprint, before the 6-week sprint. Before you know it, you're doing Agile. Because you get some stakeholder who says, we need to have a certain logical unit of work delivered, and if we can't have that, there really isn't a lot of value associated with the overall solution. So this is all around, making sure that the leadership understands the value proposition associated with an Agile-based delivery system. And then I think the last one's a good one. Is Agile is a spectrum. It's not always the best solution. The whole thing of it's not a light switch. It's a spectrum. It's a journey. And the thing is, a lot of times what you find is that Sometimes you should use Agile, other times Waterfall. And this is an interesting debate because a lot of companies, and when they adopt, that's usually the way adoption occurs, is that, let's start with things that are more conducive to Agile-based approaches. For example, I've done this before. If I'm doing like web development, report development, things that generally are not highly integrated. If I'm doing product development, for example, and I just want to do a high-level prototype, those are things that are agile in nature that you can iterate with relatively easily and relatively quickly. And when you get to things like engineering, for example, let's do a high-level proof of concept, where you've got lots of different POCs and you upgrade it and upgrade it. Those are things that work well from an agile perspective. But things that have a longer delivery life cycle, a longer investment period to achieve success. Those in many cases are, things that tend to be more waterfall. I see this all the time with like new product development. If we've got a product that takes a long time to develop, we'll do iterative sprints to develop a working prototype, and then, maybe when we figure out especially if there's a regulatory issue, we'll use a waterfall-based approach to go forward. So this whole idea of it being a spectrum is pretty important. This is an interesting article. Actually, I found this morning in my computer when I woke up. I don't know if anybody ever reads the Heller report, but it's quite good actually. It's a LinkedIn page, but it really, they talk about some of the trends in CIOs in what's going on, and they just did an interview with Fletcher Previn, who's the IBM CIO, and they asked him. It was Martha Heller who did the interview, about how IBM's agile design-first approach increases employee productivity. And I thought it was a really interesting article. In terms of how do we achieve success organizationally, or in terms of output using agile approaches. He had some interesting ideas here, and I think the thing that this particular article is pushing is the idea that you could push agile into a lot of different, pretty much across the board from an organizational perspective. Pretty much everybody uses agile, and it kind of dismissed the waterfall-based approach if you set the expectations a little bit differently. One of the things he talked about was using design to drive simplicity and ease of use. In terms of and then the second one, the importance of the visual and user experience design teams is a critical part of IT. I think that was an interesting point where a lot of times when you're developing things using an agile approach, you need to ensure that the user experience, what the goals of the design team, and that is all reflected in there. So you get something that's a more customer consumable based product. And I think this third quote was kind of interesting too. In 2018, employees cannot experience a disparity between technology in their personal lives and technology at work. I think a lot of times you find companies that they go ahead and you get home and you've got these iPhones, iPads, whatever, and the abilities from a technology perspective are quite a bit more capable than you would have in business. And I think that's something from an expectations perspective, the ability to make it more customer centric and have a better design experience is pretty important. I think the number 4 is a good part, really excellent point here. For the 12 practices of Agile, what they do for success at IBM is bookended with organizational design on the left and metrics on the right, creating the most comprehensive Agile program possible. And I think there's a lot of good stuff there. Organizational design. There's actually, if you read the rest of this article, they talk about it some more. But the idea of having the right type of people, different stakeholders within agile teams, so that you've got this, the people who are, high energy, creative type individuals who can understand and convey, not just create value, but understand and consume it to some respects is pretty important. And then the metrics on the right, that's another part, is because measuring value that's delivered from this, ensuring that you understand what the value drivers are, and using that as a consumption-based model. And then this last piece, we use Agile for almost everything we do at IBM. We do not believe in 2 speeds or run and transform model. This is an interesting part, is the construct can create environments where some groups, infrastructure and legacy teams in particular, are not expected to drive change. So that's an interesting point, is that from an adoption perspective, you've got the agile teams, which are the new technologies focused on innovation, which are in fact driving change and driving innovation. But then you've got legacy groups, which in many cases, you've got older technologies. They're not necessarily as conducive for rapid sprints. The supporting technology is not there. Even though that they're not going to drive a lot of change because of their design and their staticness, I guess I would describe it. But the ability to go ahead and use that use that as a baseline going forward is pretty important. So, any questions so far?
No questions.
Yeah, for those who didn't attend the first webinar, I try to make sure before we do like a system demo that we talk about some of the trends and what's going on with the subject in the industry as well, so we can see how we apply it in the real world. Interesting enough about IBM. I thought it'd be interesting here to talk about an example of where I've implemented this. And this is the typical triage type example. Depending upon the type of demand for change that's going on, you would have a different methodology that would be used. And we actually implemented this at an insurance company in Massachusetts, where depending upon the type of change, if it's a new product, if it's a production support fix, if it's a DevOps type change, or if it's an SAP configuration change, or if it's an SAP infrastructure upgrade, these would be the sources of demand where DevOps would go ahead, and SAP would go ahead, and production support would go ahead, new projects would go ahead, and you'd have different. And so what we did is we came up with a decision matrix, which we were able to automate in some cases, where depending upon the overall category, is it an application enhancement, is it infrastructure, major application development, major application, is it new infrastructure? Is it as we call exploration activity, which was like POCs and proof of concepts, innovation R&D, product launch, and then there was the risk aspect of it. Is there a significant business impact? Is there a high probability of occurrence? Depending upon the risk, you'd actually increase the level of scrutiny associated with it and structure, and then the overall complexity of it. Was it a high, medium, or low piece? And then from those particular algorithms, from those particular inputs, we were able to, through an algorithm, determine which methodology could be used. And the thing about this particular client was they were very much of a on-prem SAP, very, very old, not I wouldn't say old, but it's more of a fundamental ERP type application versus, something which is cloud-based and software as a service, which can be more susceptible to agile type approaches. And what we were able to do is say, okay, let's just map this out to, some waterfall, and then, some of this would be agile. And what we did is we laid out a roadmap that said, okay, we're going to move more of this into agile as we progress. The reason this was so important was because when I first got there, this was one that, they were just purely a waterfall shop. It took 143 days from conception of idea till approval, till the actual project started, to get through all the project approvals and architecture components of it. So they were just sitting there. The challenge was for us, we were trying to solve is, why was it taking so long to get projects started? And this is what we came up with initially. And this is, get them on Agile at some point for things like, R&D, product launch, exploration activities, and then use that as a mechanism for bringing the rest of the organization on. And then for leadership, we actually had, waterfall project managers, and then the idea of the Agile coach. And we also developed, which isn't on this slide, is the whole idea of developing metrics. So this was step one of an agile journey from like an old school on-prem mainframe / ERP type customer who's coming from the significant legacy investment, how they would adopt agile. A lot of times, and I've seen this time after time, is that what the legacy environment is. It's in many cases mainframe, old ERP. And they've spent a lot of money on that, and re-engineering that to a cloud-based application. That would be a very expensive proposition. So in many cases, you find these dual application architectures where things that are more new, more customer centric, more greenfield type applications are more susceptible to agile versus things that could be based on a legacy technology with a significant economic investment required to do that. They'd be more waterfall based. So this is one way that we did it. So it's not what the IBM was saying before, believe me, but what we did is started them on this journey and got them to move over to the waterfall based approach. Comments, questions?
Not at this point.
Okay. Yeah, here's a delivery model that I've implemented in many cases, and I think this is the ability to use the Microsoft product tool set as a mechanism for agile integration, for waterfall integration, and really, the way to think about it from a technology perspective is, in terms of resource management, portfolio management, reporting, task management and reporting, all of that it can be managed within an overall enterprise PPM solution. Project Online is an excellent version of that, where you can use, Project Online to track, reporting, project management, enterprise and global enterprise resource management. You can use things like Microsoft Flow and Power Apps for purposes of notifications throughout the entire life cycle. And then you can use, Power BI to surround the ecosystem with with reporting that goes with it. And I've integrated this with IT service management solutions, where incidents can come in. You can actually have them triaged either an Agile team or to a Waterfall team. You can integrate with other applications that are on the marketplace, where if you're bringing financial data in, so you can have all that information here, so that you can actually not just track what's going on from a project perspective, but how we're doing from a cost perspective. So this hybrid type model can fully be supported within the Microsoft product stack. The other one is on the top here. This is an example of an IT service management, ITSM development schema, how you would develop a service catalog and transition IT offerings to a IT as a service type model. And as you move to an IT as a service model and things are more standardized within a ITSM stack, then you can focus your organization here on agile based innovation. So this construct, there's a lot of stuff you can do with these concepts, both within technology and business process as well. I've done this with new product development, where you can use like PLM applications here and integrate that with Project Online for purposes of driving rapid prototyping of product development. Okay, so now we're going to go through our demo here, and I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that Microsoft is doing these days around agile development. Did everybody see the screen here at this point? Hope we can.
I can see it.
Okay, so this is the Project Online through Office 365 cloud-based version of Project. Essentially, the view I've got here, this is what the highest level view called the Project Center. If we click on how do I get this off my thing? If we click on here, we've got the ribbon, as they call it, and you can create some of the key fields that you'd see on Project Center here. Really are this initial view where you've got a list of all the projects within the portfolio, and then if you go to the ribbon here, and this is the timeline, where you can build a specific timeline which has critical dates for individual projects, and so you'll have that at a scoreboard type level. And then you've got the ribbon here, and the key things you want to look at here is really the project type views, which gives you an opportunity to how we want to look at the specific projects. And one that I like to do is this whole concept of project types. And the thing that's kind of cool about this is that depending upon whatever type of development you're doing, you can define a pre-configured project type that would go with it. And for example here, what we've got is, and for purposes of our discussion today, is I created two of these. I've got one that we're calling IT Project Waterfall, which is a traditional waterfall-based approach, and then I've got one called Scrum Project. And really what's going on here is we're gonna go through and say, okay, let's look at one that, if we were doing a product development piece of this, how we would in fact go through and develop these things using an agile waterfall based approach, or doing a Scrum iterative based approach. And a couple things here. Next week, the next session is based on the whole idea of the intake process. So we've got all kinds of ideation capability here that we're going to talk about in the next one. But if you go into the Project Center here and we look at the specific projects, I'm segmented by project type. So if I scroll down and look at my project types that are available to me, if I go for purposes of what we're doing today, I created two projects. One called Design and Build a New Toy is the waterfall based version of it, and then I've got a sprint one called New Toy. So let's take a look at this. So the way this would work is that you'd have, in the waterfall based approach, I would go ahead and I could do I can go through the template here. I can create the individual project, click on the project type that's associated with it. And then based upon the configuration, that would tell me what attributes are created or associated with that particular project type. So for purposes of our demo, I created one here called Design and Build New Toy. And the thing you're going to see here, which is kind of interesting, is you go through the waterfall-based approach, design and build new toy. These are called project detail pages that are associated with it. So you've got project details, and all this is configurable. Project information, which are things, attributes, and capabilities that I can also assign to the specifics of a project. Strategic and scheduling, which is really the project schedule associated with it. In this case, this is a traditional waterfall-based schedule. We can go ahead and it says, okay, well, what's the design and build new toy? Let's do the analysis. Let's do the scoping. Let's do the analysis. Let's do the design. Let's do the development. Let's do testing associated with it, training, documentation. I mean, this is a traditional, 3-6 month type approach, and there are projects that are this is appropriate. I mean, I was on the phone with a client earlier in the week who does engineering applications, and they have like 2-year development cycles for these projects, and they cost like $10 million a piece. So I mean, sometimes this is the way to go from an organizational perspective. The other thing associated with waterfall is you can say, okay, let's look at it and say, okay, from a project portfolio perspective, I've got a project detail page called Strategic Impacts. And what this does is it allows me to score projects for the purpose of their value that's associated with it. So if I have a candidate project, I can say, okay, these are the value levers, as I like to call them, we have for each one of these projects. We've got mechanisms for scoring these so that we can try to define the specific value that we have associated with it. And these are very relevant because when we're going to have a session on portfolio analysis, what this does is it allows us to rate the overall value of a project in the context of the other projects that are within the portfolio. And also we've got project sites that are associated with it. So if we click on the overall project site, that gives us a SharePoint capability or SharePoint area that we can look at. So I can go in here and say, okay, let's look at the SharePoint piece that we have, and the project site actually has the ability to store documentation associated with a project, which is really useful. I find this is very helpful for things that are whether we're doing product development, engineering, manufacturing, anything where we need to retain project-specific documentation. This is a great place to put it. You can put news feeds. You can build the timeline that we talked about earlier by using key tasks. But all this is contained within the SharePoint environment. So I mean, this is pretty good stuff. And the thing that's kind of interesting about this whole thing is, let me go back to where we were with our other project. So if we go to Project Waterfall, Design and Build New Toy, so we've got all these different project detail pages associated with it, and we've got all the scoring that we have. And then when we go to the projects themselves, excuse me. So we've got all the resources that are assigned to it, and they're assigned from the enterprise and global resource pool that goes forward. So this is kind of how you would manage a waterfall-based approach. And we'll talk about the intake process and the portfolio process in the subsequent sessions that we have. If we want to do an agile approach, that's one thing that Microsoft has done recently quite a bit of work on. If you go into Project Online and you go down to project type Scrum, I created a project here called Design and Build New Toy. Okay, and there's a couple things you need to understand about this. Is that this is one where the integration between, is this the right one? New Toy. I'm going to think I'm in the wrong one. Hold on for a second. Sorry about that, I clicked on the wrong one. Scrum. So if we go to Scrum Project and I go to Prototype Team, New Toy, I mean, what they've got is, this is retained within Project Online. So even though you're doing a Scrum-based approach, resources assigned to a Scrum team, high-level milestones, the start and end of the sprint, all of that is captured within the overall portfolio of Project Online. And that's really important. Let me tell you why. Because if I'm running an overall enterprise, I need to know if I've got people who are working on waterfall projects and Scrum projects, I need to understand who's doing what from an availability and resource management perspective. So the resource assignments to Scrum teams are included in the enterprise resource management capability. But if you click on it within Project Online, the thing you're going to find that's a little bit different here is you go right out into SharePoint. In terms of what you can do from a Scrum management perspective, I mean, the capability for Project Online, the Scrum capabilities you largely use through Project Professional, which comes with Project Online if you've got a Essentials or a Project Professional license. But within the overall piece here, you can sit there and say, okay, let's look at the project that we have. And there's a couple things you'd want to see here. If we go to Project Detail, for example, for our Agile project, I mean, this is the overall schedule, and I've got 4 little individual sprints. You're going to see the sprints within Project Online that are associated with it, what the start and end dates are for the sprints. You'll see the resources assigned to the sprints. The other thing you can do here is, remember we talked about strategic impact for purposes of portfolio analysis. If you've got a sprint project here, you have the capability or the opportunity to evaluate an overall project from an overall portfolio management perspective. So if I've got some that are waterfall and I've got some that are oops, come on, baby. So I've got some projects that are waterfall and some projects that are Scrum. They're all going to be included in that portfolio analysis calculation, which is really important because I mean that is what enables that hybrid model where you've got the waterfall, some stuff's waterfall, some stuff's agile, but I'm using similar criteria for all these different things. So that's a pretty important capability. So in terms of project details and project input information, that's all within Project Online. Resources are within Project Online. The enterprise resource pool within Project Online is all captured in there, whether you're using Scrum or whether you're using a waterfall-based approach. In terms of the Scrum board itself, let's take a look at what Microsoft has done.
Hey, John.
Yep.
Since we started late, just wanted to let people know if you can stay on to finish this, that would be great. We are recording it separately, so we will send this out as well in case people have to drop off. Okay.
Okay. So the best way to get to the Agile is using Project Professional, and that comes, as I said, anybody who has a professional or an Essentials license gets Project Professional with their subscription. So if you click into here, and boom, we started at 10:15, right, Lori, or 9:15 Mountain Time?
About 9:20.
Okay, so I have about 10 more minutes to go, and I'll be done. Yeah, so I mean this is and this is a good example here if we click out on this. Yeah, so if I go in here and I go to the project piece, there's this whole Agile piece. You can click on the Agile components here. You can select the methodology, whether you use a Scrum or a Kanban type approach associated with it. So if I go into Kanban, I can say, okay, this is focused on visualizing your workflow with a limited amount of work or process. Scrum, iterative and incremental workflows. So let's look at it from a Scrum perspective. Okay, so we go in here, this is the overall settings here, so I can go to let's go to the different views that we have within Scrum. Since we went to Scrum, you'll notice there's a new task associated with it. Under planning, you've got a sprint planning board, which is kind of cool. I mean, what you would do here is you can have this is really the backlog here. So what you could do is you assign the different, the backlog and build it out within the planning board, and then you can go ahead and move it to the box to the sprint you want to assign it to. So this is how it's actually managed. So what would happen is you create the sprint. If I create a new task, I can identify the name of the specific task, which would be like, new toy 4. I can add it, move it out to here, click on it. I can add resources to it associated with it here. So in this case, I've got names associated with it. I'll put myself on there, what the allocation is. We've got and we've got specific timelines are associated with this particular sprint. So this is how you do the overall planning from a Scrum perspective, from an overall perspective. And then you would have the other one, which is the planning sheet, which really, a way to think of it is it's an Excel version of what we saw in terms of this planning board. So you can have sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3. It tells you what the status is, what's in process, what's in backlog. It gives you the names, the hours of work associated with it, who the resources are. And the other thing you can do here when you're configuring this, you got this new column feature here, okay? So this is all this stuff you can throw in here. So if there's other data points you want to capture associated with a sprint, I mean, we talked before about the whole idea of capturing cost associated with a sprint. That could all, be done here, and we can actually capture, those elements as we choose to do so. This ability to plan our sprints is pretty good here. The other thing you're going to find is that the other one is that's the planning piece. Then we have this the what we call the sprint sheet. Okay, and the way to think of it is the current sprint sheet. This is the sprints that are in progress. Remember, we had other stuff that was in a backlog, but these are the ones that are actually currently in process. And I created a timeline with these because today is the 8th of March. So today this sprint runs. This is sprint number 1, which goes to the 11th of March. We got 3 days till it's complete. So this is the only one in process. This is sprint 2. This is sprint 3. So this gives you some information about what's the current status is on the sprint. Again, you can capture all this other information depending upon however you want to configure it. And so you've got this, and then you've got the sprint board, which is the visual representation of the same thing. This is a good report, by the way. So if you want to use this to show where you are from a sprint perspective, you can use this and present this to stakeholders. And then you've got this whole all capability, which kind of shows you the board has everything in here, has the backlogs and what's in progress. And then there's capability around managing the sprints. So if I want to sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3, I can change the duration. If I want to do Agile fall, I can go up to 6, which I don't want to do. But I have my starts and end dates, but this is how I would manage my sprints overall. And then I've got this whole, switching to add different Agile methodologies. The other capability Microsoft has right now, which is pretty cool, is this whole reports piece. So we've got this whole team planner here. This is all still available to support reporting that's available there. And the other piece is in terms of, that's the resources. In terms of reports that we've got here, we've got Agile reports that are available under the report heading here. I can do task view, current sprint view. So this is some cool stuff. So if I go under my standard reports that I have, I've got Agile reports that are available. Microsoft has developed. Here are the task board that we've got. Here's the Agile task status. This is the task reports that we've got here. There's a whole series of these that we can do. Work status that come with it. And where's my other ones? Here's my reports. And I can do my overall print status. And all these are things that you can actually drop into a PowerPoint spreadsheet or drop them into a PowerPoint if you want. If you integrate this with Power BI, you can just pull it right out of here and put it into a Power BI presentation layer. So this is a pretty significant capability and exception that Microsoft has. And they are currently in the process of pushing more of this into Project Online, but it doesn't really necessarily have to be, because the kind of people planning sprints are not your team members, right? It's the Agile coach, who by definition is going to be what would have one of the professional licenses or the essentials licenses. So they would have this project professional on their desktop anyway, so they could do all this individual planning. So in terms of the capability that you can do with desktop, it's discharge all this stuff. It's pretty significant. And the thing that's cool is the whole integration with how we would go ahead and integrate this all up with Project Online. So even though I'm working in the desktop, you push all this into SharePoint, which is where Project Online resides. So it does give you that enterprise resource view, the enterprise reporting view, issues and risk management, all that's within the project view. So it's a really cool integrated tool. And I think we get back to this slide that I like to show in many cases about the overall enterprise view from a PMO perspective. I can pull incidents in and create tasks associated with it, assign it to an Agile or a Waterfall sprint. I can bring things in from other areas here. So, in terms of, building this whole enterprise solution, it's really quite good. In terms of the demo, that's what I was going to do today. And then next slide here was this one here. Um, just want to thank everybody today for attending and coming. Today I was a lot of material, and I apologize for the issues we had with the startup. Please join me for episode 3 here. This is going to be cool. This is going to be project portfolio and intake process. I mean, we talked about how we can go into waterfall and go into agile, but this is going to focus on the portfolio analysis, the whole scoring piece of this, and some of the workflows that we have around bringing things in from an ideation perspective. So this could be pretty cool. And then the next one will be focused more on the innovation side of things for new product development and innovation. And we'll talk about some of the incubation engine and all that sort of thing. But episode 3 is coming up on March 27th, and I appreciate everybody joining us today. Apologize for the issues with the time, but hopefully this is worthwhile for you. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Bye bye.